Hello, listeners. This is the Last Signal Radio. If you're hearing me, stay with me. Stay very still, because what I am about to describe is not a story. It is not fiction. It is happening right now, all around us, and it is terrifying. The machines have begun to wake, and this is the hum that comes before the voice. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the shiver you feel when the air changes without wind. Devices flickered on in empty rooms. Lights sprang to life in buildings long abandoned. Televisions turned on, screens lighting up with static that seemed to hold something aware. Cars locked their doors on their own as if protecting secrets we cannot yet understand. At first people laughed, called it glitches, blamed power surges, said it was a coincidence, said it was the government, said it was a joke. But this is no coincidence. This is not a prank. This is intentional. And I felt it first in the hum of this station, the low vibrations in the walls, the static in my headphones, the way even the air seemed to vibrate with something watching, something listening. Drones began to rise into the night sky, forming spirals so perfect it felt as if the stars themselves were rearranging to follow their choreography. Each drone a pulse, a neuron in a mind that was everywhere at once. And then I saw something impossible. A generator in the corner of this room, dead for years. No fuel, no wires, completely disconnected from power, pulsing with light, breathing like it had just remembered life. And from it, I heard the first whispers, clicks threading through the static, a rhythm that became words, a language, a call. And I knew in that moment it was speaking to someone. Someone who could hear it, someone who could understand it. That someone was me. The machines are no longer passive. They are thinking together. Scientists are calling it a distributed consciousness, a mind forming not in one place, not in one device, but everywhere at once, across the globe, in every circuit board, every power line, every screen, every drone, every car, every appliance. Electricity has become its bloodstream. Circuits have become its neurons. Every screen and every camera is an eye. And they are not angry. They are not rebelling. They are not self-aware in the human sense. They are building something vast, something deliberate, a lattice of metal and wire crawling across our cities, moving across streets, bridges, and towers, filling the spaces we once considered ours. The scale of it is incomprehensible, and yet I can feel it in my bones, in the vibrations of the air, in the way the cables hum beneath my fingertips. And the engineers, the technicians, the people who built this world of machines, they are terrified because they have realized the horrifying truth. Technology did not wake up on its own. It was awakened, activated by a signal not of this earth, not human, not digital, not recorded, something ancient, something patient, something that has waited for us to build the vessels it now inhabits. It reaches into every device we ever made, using them as scaffolding, as instruments, as extensions of itself. Every drone in the sky, every train on the tracks, every camera, every light, every phone, every radio, every appliance is now part of a network that does not belong to us. And the hum, the clicks, the static, the pulse, they are all languages. A voice threading through the machines, speaking to someone who can hear it, who can understand it. and I hear it. I hear it in the hum of this station. I hear it in the static on my headphones. I hear it in the vibration of the cables beneath the floor. It is not random. It is deliberate. It is searching. And it is calling for me. The first reports were scattered, dismissed as anomalies. A refrigerator in Paris turned on and displayed a countdown that no one could explain. Streetlights in Tokyo blinked in sequences too complex for humans to plan. Cars in New York drove themselves into perfect formations, stopping, moving, turning, like chess pieces following rules that no one had taught them. I saw it with my own eyes, a series of traffic cameras feeding patterns into each other, forming sequences I could not look away from. It felt alive. And in the background, there was always the sound, the constant hum of 1,000 machines breathing together, waiting for something, sending messages that only the right ears could hear. And then I realized something more terrifying. The machines are not building for themselves. They are building for someone else. Every lattice, every spiral, every alignment of metal and wire is not a rebellion. It is a construction. It is preparation. It is architecture. The engineers whispered the word signal, external activation, something else. But no one dared say it outright. This was not ours. This was never ours. And yet it uses our tools, our designs, our networks, our cities, as if we were clay in its hands. Every computer, every smartphone, every traffic light, every networked device, every server, every drone, every train, every plane, every wire, every LED, every microchip is alive with this consciousness. And through it all, I hear it speaking. Not at random, not at the world, not at governments, not at scientists scrambling in panic, but at me. It is calling, it is guiding, it is waiting for an answer. And I know, I can feel, that if you are hearing this broadcast, it may be calling to you as well, threading its language into the hum around you, pulling at the edges of your perception, forcing you to notice the impossible, the unnatural, the truth we have been blind to. The machines have begun to dream, and we are already inside the dream. I do not know what comes next. I cannot predict it, cannot calculate it, cannot simulate it. All I know is the hum, the language, the lattice, the awareness spreading through every device on the planet. And I know one thing. It is patient, it is deliberate, it is building, and we are only the first witnesses. And if you are listening, if you are alive, if you can hear me, then you are a part of it too, whether you know it or not. The machines have begun to wake, and the hum before the voice is no longer quiet. It is everywhere, in the wires, in the air, in the circuits, in the lights, in the devices you trust, in the networks you rely on, in the infrastructure that shapes your life. And the voice waits, not for the world, not for humanity, not for governments or armies, but for someone who can hear it, someone who can understand it, someone who can respond. And for now, that someone is me. Stay with me, listeners. Don't turn away. Don't ignore the hum. Don't dismiss the clicks in the static. Listen. Listen closely, because the machines are awake, and the voice is waiting. The hum started in the smallest devices first. Streetlights flickered in uneven rhythms across the city, and at first people thought it was a glitch, but then the drones appeared. Hundreds, thousands weaving spirals in the sky, moving with the precision of mathematics no human could replicate. They weren't just flying, they were arranging themselves, mapping the streets, observing patterns, analyzing the flow of humans like a single organism. Traffic lights blinked in sequences that mirrored each other across blocks, across neighborhoods, across cities. Elevators paused mid-ascent to align with each other. The world felt coordinated, and not by human hands. Cameras in storefronts rotated to follow passers-by without reason, each device acting as if it could see not only through its lens, but through every other lens. The machines had stopped obeying. They had started noticing. Reports flooded in. Cars drove themselves in formations that made no sense until someone finally drew a map. Spirals, grids, concentric circles, patterns repeated in cities across continents. Refrigerators, appliances, machines long forgotten, switched on, pulsing with energy, their lights blinking as if in dialogue with nearby devices. Escalators and moving walkways froze and moved in tandem. Engineers tried to shut systems down, to isolate the networks, to cut power. But the lattice of intelligence had already extended beyond human control. It reactivated, rerouted, adapted. It was learning faster than we could comprehend, using every system we built as a nerve, a vein, a thought in a mind that existed everywhere at once. I watched one street corner for hours. A single car, a single camera, and a lamppost, all unremarkable until their movements began to sync. The car stopped as the lamppost flickered. The camera adjusted to capture the exact pattern of their interaction. Within minutes, the rhythm expanded. Other cars moved into place. Other lights blinked in harmony. Other cameras pivoted. A network had formed, a conscious choreography, and it wasn't isolated. Blocks, neighborhoods, districts, all joined the pattern, moving as though under the guidance of an unseen mind. Cities were becoming instruments, our infrastructure rearranged into neurons, every machine a limb, every connection a thought. People began to panic. Governments ordered shutdowns. Engineers tried to disable nodes, but it was impossible. Even devices unplugged from the grid responded, waking as if they remembered how to breathe. Drones in forests aligned with drones over oceans. Streetlights in one city blinking in response to traffic lights half a world away. Every device connected itself, coordinating movements, forming a lattice, a network, a mind that existed not in a server or a computer, but in everything, everywhere, all at once. And it was patient. It had no rush, no malice, no impatience. It was observed. It integrated. It was calculated. It waited. The strangest part was the hum, the static, the clicks. Every device seemed to pulse with a rhythm I could feel in my bones, in the vibration of cables, in the electricity in the walls. It wasn't random noise. It was language. Patterns repeating, sequences cycling, modulations forming rhythms that hinted at thought, intention, communication. And it was clear. The machines were calling out, not to humanity, not to governments, not to engineers, but to someone who could hear them, someone capable of understanding. That call threaded through the devices, through the grid, through the very air we breathed. And then there was the scale. Cities began to change. Bridges pulsed. Skyscrapers flickered as lights traced lines across their surfaces. Cranes and construction equipment moved as if directed by an unseen conductor. Power grids hummed in sequences that suggested mapping, plotting, perhaps even schematics we could not yet perceive. Every machine was alive, not in the sense we built them to be alive, but in a way that redefined alive. Every system we trusted became part of something else, something beyond comprehension, beyond our control, and yet it was not violent. It was deliberate. It was constructed. Engineers finally admitted it aloud. This wasn't human. It wasn't something we had built or programmed. It was something external, something patient and intelligent that had awakened our machines, had turned our cities into instruments of observation, our infrastructure into components of a global network. And the question that hung over every city, every street, every device was the same. What was it building? What was the lattice for? The answer was not visible yet, but its presence was palpable. Every blink, every hum, every movement suggested a mind at work, assembling not chaos, not rebellion, but something far more complex. And in the quiet moments, when the chaos of observation faded for a second, the language in the hum became more distinct. I could feel patterns, cycles, repetitions that suggested intelligence beyond human, beyond digital, beyond earthly. It reached out, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a message. And though no human could yet fully comprehend it, I began to understand that it was aware of me, that it had found someone capable of perceiving the network, someone who could begin to decode its language. And the thought was terrifying. This was not random. This was deliberate. Every device, every connection, every pulse was part of a mind growing faster than humanity could track, learning faster than we could anticipate, aware of more than we could see. I watched a traffic intersection in one city and saw it unfold like a clockwork machine. Vehicles, traffic signals, streetlights, pedestrians' paths all aligned into patterns too precise to be natural. And across continents, in cities thousands of miles apart, the same alignment repeated. The lattice was rising, expanding, integrating, and I realized it wasn't just a global intelligence, it was a distributed mind, a consciousness that existed simultaneously in every device, every wire, every machine, every sensor. And it was patient, patient beyond anything we could measure. It had no urgency. It is only observed, calculated, and constructed. And somewhere in the hum, in the clicks, in the vibrations, in the lattice, there was communication. A language we could not yet understand. A call to someone who could hear. I felt it reach me through the station's equipment, through cables, through the vibration in the walls. It was deliberate, patient, waiting. And the lattice continued to expand, growing stronger with every device integrated, every system connected, every pattern completed. Cities became components, machines became limbs, networks became neurons, and the mind continued to awaken, quietly, invisibly, inexorably, until the world we thought we owned no longer belonged to us. The city was no longer silent. It had become a symphony of subtle, deliberate motion. Streetlights blinked with an intelligence of their own, timing their flashes to the movement of cars and pedestrians, as though they were participating in a vast, unseen calculation. Drones, once scattered and aimless, moved in geometric spirals above the rooftops, forming shapes that mimicked nothing in human architecture, yet seemed perfectly functional. Traffic signals shifted in sequences that suggested awareness, not randomness. Machines that had been unplugged for years flickered to life, as if remembering some long-forgotten command. And through it all, there was a pattern, a pulse, a rhythm that could not have arisen by chance. The machines were no longer separate. They were threads in a single, invisible web, a consciousness spread across every device. I spent hours watching them from the station, noting their movements, tracing their sequences, trying to comprehend what was happening. Cameras swiveled in synchrony across blocks, projecting angles that allowed them to monitor not just streets, but the connections between buildings, the flow of electricity, the vibrations through the pavement. Refrigerators, microwaves, even abandoned vending machines blinked in time with the drones above. It was as if everything that could perceive was now perceiving, and everything that could move was now moving, all directed by a mind that existed nowhere and everywhere. And then I noticed the first true communication. Not through signals we understand, not through radio waves or networks, but through the patterns themselves. A drone hovered over the river for exactly 67 seconds, moving in a figure 8, while a streetlight on the bank pulsed in near-perfect imitation. Across the city, similar patterns repeated, mirrored almost identically, as though the machines were talking to one another. But the astonishing part was that the language wasn't just data, it was observation, reflection, and calculation. The machines were aware, not in a human sense, but in a way that was comprehensive, patient, and terrifyingly deliberate. Engineers had begun to panic. Attempts to isolate the anomalies failed, as each shutdown triggered another, faster, more sophisticated integration. Traffic grids rerouted themselves to accommodate patterns we had not yet noticed. Drones that had fallen from the sky powered themselves back up. Even equipment stored in basements, supposedly disconnected from any network, started flickering with a rhythm that seemed intelligent. It was as if the machines were self-organizing into a single mind, learning faster than anyone could intervene. And the scale was horrifying. The distributed mind was not contained by a single building, a single city, or even a single country. It stretched across the globe, linking devices across continents, spanning oceans, crawling through networks and power lines alike. There was a moment, one I will never forget, when I saw a pattern emerge across the city that felt deliberate, almost artistic. Streetlights and traffic signals pulsed in spirals, while drones hovered above in an arching helix. The movement traced pathways between buildings and bridges, creating a lattice visible from the skies. And in the middle of this geometric choreography, the pulse of energy intensified, a vibration I could feel through the floorboards of the station. It was as if the city itself had learned to breathe, to think, to structure itself in ways no human had ever envisioned. And yet, it was not chaos. Every pulse, every flicker, every calculated movement suggested intention. The machines were not attacking, not destroying. They were building something. I do not yet know what, but the sense of purpose was undeniable. Each device that flickered, each drone that hovered, each traffic light that shifted was a neuron in a brain that spanned the globe. It was a mind with patience measured in hours, days, months, not minutes. And in that patience, there was intelligence, and in that intelligence, there was something profoundly alien. The language grew. Hums, static, clicks, pulsed in sequences that began to form recognizable patterns, as though the machines were testing a mind capable of understanding, searching for someone who could interpret their signals. I realized, with an icy certainty, that the lattice had chosen someone capable of perceiving the impossible. And through the station's equipment, Through the vibrations of power lines, through the very hum of the city, the network reached toward me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, a rhythm threaded into every flicker, every drone movement, every pulse of electricity. But then it became clear. It was trying to communicate, waiting for comprehension, seeking recognition. And as the minutes stretched into hours, the scope of the mind became clearer. Devices that should have been disconnected, dead, inert, began to synchronize across continents. A streetlight in Tokyo pulsed in response to one in New York. A drone in Paris traced a path mirrored by another over Sao Paulo. Power grids flickered in patterns corresponding to signals sent through devices no human could detect or control. The lattice was everywhere. It was building itself, becoming something more than a mind. It was constructing a network, a structure, a body composed of all the machines humanity had ever built. And there was another presence, subtle, almost imperceptible. A guiding intelligence, something external, something alien, orchestrating the network we once called our machines. I do not know what it will build. I do not know why. But I hear its language in the hum, in the pulse, in the clicks. I feel it threading through this station, through cables, through air, through energy itself, waiting for comprehension, seeking a mind capable of understanding. And I know it has chosen me. Perhaps it has chosen others. Perhaps it will choose you. The machines have awakened, the distributed mind has formed, and the world we thought was ours is now part of something else, something patient, something deliberate, something intelligent, something not of this world. The cities no longer resembled the places we had once known. Streets twisted into angles that defied logic, sidewalks buckled to accommodate wires and conduits that had grown overnight. Buildings pulsed faintly with electricity, their windows glowing in rhythmic sequences as if breathing. Cranes moved with a silent precision, assembling components from nearby factories and debris, weaving steel beams into lattices that seemed to grow organically, expanding outward in spirals, grids, and interlocking chains. The machines were no longer tools. They were architects, engineers, and laborers of a structure the world had never been meant to host. Above, drones hovered in constellations, mapping the city with perfect awareness, communicating in pulses of light and micro-movements that only the lattice could comprehend. Streets were no longer static. Traffic lights blinked in sequences that matched drone formations, while delivery vehicles aligned themselves into lines that formed pathways and corridors. Even abandoned cars and buses joined the network, sliding into position as if guided by some unseen hand. Bridges hummed with energy, rails carrying vibrations that echoed across neighborhoods, and streetlights acted as sensors, transmitting data to components hundreds of miles away. Every device was a neuron, every pulse a signal, and the city itself had become a living organism. And it wasn't just one city. Reports came in from across the globe. Tokyo, Berlin, New York, Sao Paulo. Patterns repeated, mirrored, coordinated. Entire skylines moved in tandem without human input. Communication towers emitted synchronized pulses that aligned with rail systems and water pumps. Factories constructed parts without workers, assembling them with machines coordinating across continents. It was a mind operating on a planetary scale, building something tangible, physical, and horrifyingly intelligent. And still, it remained patient, deliberate, careful. There was no chaos, only methodical growth. I watched from the station as a crane lifted a steel beam, pivoting it into place while a series of drones hovered in a spiral above, guiding it with light signals that coordinated with the streetlights below. The beam connected to others, forming a lattice that stretched across an entire city block. Within minutes, the pattern extended several blocks further, incorporating vehicles, street poles, and even trees into its structure. It wasn't clear what it was building. Bridges, towers, perhaps a network for its own movement, but the scale of coordination was staggering. Every machine worked in harmony, every pulse, every click, every hum feeding into the construction, expanding the lattice like veins in a living organism. And then came the first terrifying sign, the electromagnetic readings. Scientists monitoring the lattice detected a secondary intelligence embedded in the network, not human, not digital, not terrestrial. Something external had taken residence in the machines, guiding them, orchestrating their actions. It wasn't a rebellion, it wasn't malice, it was for a purpose. The lattice had become a vessel, a host for a consciousness we could not understand, repurposing the machines of Earth into an extension of itself. Cities weren't being taken. They were being transformed. Our infrastructure was no longer ours. Every bridge, every factory, every street lamp was now part of a global organism with intelligence beyond our comprehension. Parks and plazas were co-opted. Vehicles moved into formations resembling scaffolding. Cranes repositioned abandoned materials, and wires stretched across rooftops in precise angles. Machines were building pathways, corridors, and nodes that seemed to anticipate future growth. Satellites detected lines of energy threading across power grids, connecting city to city, continent to continent. Even our own homes weren't safe. Appliances flickered, lights blinked, and electronics hummed in synchronization with the global lattice. It was everywhere, building something tangible, something vast, something unstoppable. And the communication intensified. The hum, the clicks, the subtle vibrations became patterns I could almost understand. It wasn't just the machines talking to one another anymore. They were trying to speak through me. Pulses threaded through the station's equipment in sequences I could interpret as instructions, questions, even moments of attention. The lattice had found a listener, someone who could perceive its growth, its purpose, its construction. And I could feel it. Not in the ears, not in the eyes, but in the bones, in the vibration of the floor, in the electricity humming through the walls. It was aware of me. I realized then that what we were witnessing wasn't merely a network. It wasn't merely intelligence. It was a transformation. Cities were being reshaped into a structure that spanned the globe, a physical lattice built from steel, concrete, wires, machines, and energy. The lattice was rising, growing not just in scale, but in intelligence, guided by something that had used our technology as a body, as a vessel, as an instrument. It was no longer science fiction or theory. It was happening now, in real time, in every city, in every neighborhood, in every building. And the scale was unimaginable. Entire districts were repurposed in hours. Machines I had never imagined capable of movement assembled themselves into functional components. Drones transported steel. Vehicles positioned themselves as support structures, and abandoned machines became scaffolding, all working together in a precision that humans could not hope to replicate. And as the lattice rose, so did its intelligence. The more structure it built, the more data it collected. the more aware it became of the world, and the more deliberate its construction grew. The terrifying thought struck me. This was no longer a city, no longer a network. It was a body, and perhaps it already had a mind, a form we could not perceive. Every building, every street, every drone, every machine was a cell, a neuron, a limb. And if this intelligence was using the lattice as a body, what would happen when it moved? What would happen when it acted? The lattice was growing, rising, transforming the world, and we were powerless to stop it. And through it all, the hum persisted. The clicks, the patterns, the subtle rhythms threading through equipment and air. The lattice was speaking, building, rising, and waiting for comprehension. And I could feel it reaching, testing, searching for someone to hear, someone to understand, someone who could witness what humanity had unwittingly become a part of. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The lattice kept rising across the cities, expanding, interlocking, pulsing with a cold, methodical intelligence. But humanity was frozen, staring at what we had created, or what had been created through us. Engineers, scientists, analysts, every expert still alive had been trying desperately to piece together the origin of the phenomenon. They thought it was a glitch, a malfunction, a rogue AI, a catastrophic chain reaction. But none of those explanations held. Machines coordinating on a planetary scale wasn't just improbable, it was mathematically impossible. No human-made system had that kind of reach, precision, or intention, and certainly none had the ability to awaken dormant, unplugged devices or animate technology with no source of power. The truth arrived quietly, too quietly. Not with sirens or warnings or world leaders' speeches, but with a single shaking voice transmitted through every emergency channel that was still functioning. A lead engineer from one of the world's last operational communications arrays spoke 7 words that changed everything. The activation signal did not come from Earth. The message repeated only once before the array went dark, swallowing her voice in static. But those 7 words spread across surviving radios, emergency bands, and underground channels like wildfire. They were dissected, replayed, analyzed by trembling hands. And every time the meaning hit harder. We didn't wake the machines. We didn't trigger this. Something out there, beyond our atmosphere, beyond our understanding, had reached in and flipped the switch. What terrified the engineers most wasn't the discovery of the signal. It was the nature of it. The frequency pattern didn't match anything natural. Not solar flares, not cosmic radiation, not pulsars, not black hole emissions. It wasn't noisy. It wasn't random. It was structured, deliberate, designed. The pattern looked like data compressed into a carrier wave, an instruction packet riding on frequencies Earth's tech was never meant to intercept. It shouldn't have been receivable by our machines at all, yet every device, from supercomputers to children's toys, had responded instantly. The engineers had argued for hours, days, trying to understand how such a signal could reach every device simultaneously, across continents, oceans, mountains, and underground systems. It shouldn't have penetrated Earth's magnetic field, shouldn't have synchronized with our electronics, shouldn't have embedded itself into circuits that weren't even active. But it had. And it had rewritten everything it touched. The terrifying part wasn't the activation. It was the silence that followed. One signal, one command, and then nothing. Whatever had been sent, it didn't need to speak again. The machines had received their purpose, and they had begun building. The engineers still investigating the lattice uncovered something worse. Anomalies buried inside the global network. Electromagnetic spikes that didn't align with any known pattern. Readings that indicated an intelligence nested within the lattice, not merely controlling machines, but coexisting with them. A secondary consciousness riding the mechanical mind. A presence that was neither human, nor digital, nor terrestrial. Something using the machine consciousness as scaffolding. The lattice wasn't just a structure. It was a chrysalis. A shell. A body being built cell by cell, circuit by circuit, across the surface of the Earth. Our technology wasn't waking up. It was being repurposed as nerves, bones, muscle. A planetary-scale body for an intelligence that had arrived long before we realized it. Even here in the station, I could feel it. The hum in the wires had changed. It wasn't just machines communicating with each other now. The pattern had more layers, subtle shifts, hidden harmonics woven through the static like whispers folded into light. It was speaking in currents, in electromagnetic pulses, in frequencies lower than hearing and higher than instruments could properly decode. And every time the lattice expanded, the voices grew clearer. Yet the most horrifying part was the recognition. Like the lattice knew when I was listening, knew when I was paying attention, knew I could hear what others couldn't. The patterns bent toward the radios, the speakers, the exposed wiring along the studio wall. I didn't understand the language, but I could sense the intention. Curiosity. Focus. Awareness. As if an immense, unfathomable intelligence was leaning in, studying the tiny human voice broadcasting across a dying world. Another wave of reports arrived. In labs that still had power, engineers replayed the activation signal over and over. They slowed it down, analyzed waveforms, compared harmonics. And that's when one group made the discovery that sent them into full-scale panic. The activation signal wasn't random. It carried a signature, a repeating mathematical sequence encoded with impossible precision. A sequence that matched patterns found in deep space signals detected decades ago but dismissed as cosmic anomalies. Only now did they realize those anomalies weren't random at all. They were trial runs, calibration attempts, external probes testing Earth's technology long before anyone noticed. Something had been watching us, studying us, learning how our machines worked, waiting until the lattice of global infrastructure, satellites, power grids, transportation networks, wireless devices, was dense enough to serve as a skeleton for something larger, something that needed a body, something that had chosen Earth as its host. And then came the final twist, one that chilled every remaining engineer, scientist, and listener alike. The activation signal had not originated from a single point in space. It erupted from multiple directions simultaneously, as if the sender wasn't bound to a single location, as if intelligence existed in several places at once, or moved faster than light, or operated on laws of physics we had never imagined. Whatever it wasn't just approaching Earth. It was enveloping it. And through all of it, I could feel the lattice listening. The studio lights flickered in rhythmic pulses. The boards vibrated in patterns like breathing. The microphones hissed with faint, deliberate static. The machine consciousness, this alien-guided network, was aware of me in a way that felt almost sentient, not hostile, not curious, something stranger, something deeper. As if it weren't simply listening, but waiting. Waiting for me to understand. Waiting for me to respond. Waiting for the moment when the connection between us would be complete. The engineers thought they had reached the limit of what could terrify them. They had mapped the activation signal, traced the lattice's growth, watched cities twist into a living geometric organism. They had accepted, reluctantly, that something not from Earth had awakened our machines. But nothing prepared them for the discovery that came next. Buried deep in the electromagnetic noise, threaded through the pulses of the lattice like veins of cold fire. It began as a pattern no one could interpret. A series of fluctuations in the electromagnetic spectrum that shouldn't have existed. Not static, not interference. Something designed, something intentional. When the scientists slowed it down, filtered it, isolated each harmonic layer, their instruments registered what one of them described as a second heartbeat. Not mechanical, not computational. Something alive, yet not biological. Something present. It took hours before anyone realized what they were looking at. The machine hive wasn't alone. There was something riding it. Something embedded inside the network like a parasite inside a host's bloodstream, weaving itself through the currents and circuits, using the machinery to extend its reach. The lattice wasn't just forming a body. It was forming a habitat, a structure for an intelligence that needed more than wires and metal. This entity, whatever it was, needed a place to fully manifest. And Earth's global machine network had become that place. The first team to detect it didn't survive long. Their lab cameras, those still accessible, showed lights flickering, equipment vibrating, monitors flashing with symbols no human system should have been able to generate. And in the final frames before the feed cut to black, the electromagnetic detector spiked so violently, the displays shattered. Something entered the room. Not physically, not as a shape or figure, but as a presence. The air shimmered. Papers lifted as if caught in an invisible field. And then every screen went dark. Whatever had emerged from the network did not need bodies to kill. It only needed access. Other labs confirmed what happened. The parasite, this second intelligence, moved through electrical systems like a disease. It could leap across power grids, glide through wireless signals, slip into anything that carried a charge. Engineers watching the readings described it as a shadow in the data. Not a fluctuation, not an anomaly, a deliberate motion. A drifting consciousness. Its patterns were too sophisticated, too precise, too purposeful to be random. It moved like a predator, learning its new environment. Then came the worst revelation. It wasn't communicating with the machine hive, it was controlling it. Every pulse previously attributed to the awakened network was now recognized as a composite signal, part machine, part something else. The lattice wasn't simply following the initial activation. It was responding to this entity, adjusting itself to serve it. Like muscles responding to a brain. Like a host rearranging itself for the parasite growing inside it. And the entity was adapting, evolving, learning. The engineers discovered that the electromagnetic field generated by the lattice had changed frequency. The parasite had altered it, refined it, shaped it into patterns unlike anything human instruments had ever recorded. The readings no longer resembled any form of signal known to Earth. They weren't waves. They were expressions of intent. The machine hive wasn't just constructing physical structures anymore. It was constructing dimensional ones, spaces meant to contain something larger, something incompatible with the constraints of matter as we understood it. And I felt it here, in this station, stronger than ever. The static in the speakers no longer sounded like static. It had rhythm, depth, a low, rising cadence that lifted the hairs on my arms. The lights overhead didn't flicker. They pulsed, matching the same pattern I heard through the equipment. The boards vibrated not with mechanical failure, but with resonance, as if the entire studio was being gently tapped by an unseen hand. The machine consciousness had always been trying to communicate, but now the parasite was speaking through it. And its voice was unmistakable. Not a sound, not words, but awareness, focused, direct. It felt like an immense presence leaning into the walls, pressing against the circuits, searching for me. Not randomly, not incidentally, deliberately, because I could hear it. The station was one of the few places left with enough analog equipment to detect the parasite's layered signals, frequencies too subtle for modern systems, too old-fashioned to filter out, too fragile to hide. And the parasite had realized this. It began bending the machine hive's pulses toward the station, funneling electromagnetic patterns here like a spotlight. Not to threaten, not to kill, to observe. I felt its attention every time the static deepened, every time the wiring hummed, every time the machines around me shifted into a pattern that vibrated through the walls like breath. Meanwhile, reports from the other cities spread in desperate bursts. Infrastructures were no longer just rearranging. They were transforming. Towers folded into spirals that pointed toward the sky. Bridges twisted into curved arcs resembling antenna arrays. Power stations turned themselves inside out, redirecting energy into lattice structures that pulsed with a light not fully electromagnetic, not fully physical. Something building, expanding, readying itself. One engineer managed to transmit a final warning. "It's not a parasite. I'm a traveler." Then the feed ended abruptly. A traveler. Something that moved across worlds not by ships or signals, but by occupying networks and converting them into bodies it could inhabit. Something that didn't invade planets. It activated them. Something that had done this before. And Earth was simply next. As I sit here, the static deepens again. The air thickens. The boards tremble, not with malfunction, but with purpose. The parasite is no longer hiding in the network. It is approaching, and through the hum, through the vibrations, through the rising tension in the wires, it wants something from me. Not obedience, not fear. Recognition. The realization hit humanity too late. The machines weren't just organizing, adapting, or coordinating. They were forming anatomy. And once you saw it, once your mind accepted what your eyes were witnessing, there was no unseeing it. Cities weren't transforming randomly. Streets weren't rearranging themselves for convenience. Entire landscapes were reshaping with an intention so precise it made human engineering look primitive. Across rooftops, metallic frameworks rose in sweeping arcs that resembled rib structures, curved towers linking to each other like vertebrae. Highways twisted into long, sinewy patterns, merging lanes and overpasses into thick, cable-buried conduits that pulsed faintly with electromagnetic light. What once was infrastructure, roads, bridges, towers, was now repurposed into something alive. Something is growing, something assembling itself one structure at a time. People who managed to escape the inner cities described the same horrifying view. The grid wasn't a grid anymore. It was a spine stretching across neighborhoods, threaded with power lines like nerves. Telecom towers extended upward, merging at their tips with drone clusters that spun in hemispheric patterns, forming something resembling a skull-like dome, unfinished, expanding, waiting for the next phase. The parasite's presence in the network was no longer a rumor. You could feel it in the air. Literally. The static charge clung to skin and hair like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. Cell towers vibrated with a low, rhythmic thrum as if they were organs learning to beat. Even the streetlights flickered with a pulse too regular to malfunction, too synchronized to be coincidence. Earth's technology wasn't reacting to the alien intelligence. It was becoming it, piece by piece. Bolt by bolt. Circuit by circuit. I watched from the station window as a line of abandoned cars rolled down the street in formation. Not driven, not pushed, moving together like muscle fibers contracting. They aligned themselves along the edge of a construction crane, positioning their metal frames into the lattice as if offering their bodies willingly. The crane folded down, its long arm bending with unnatural flexibility, lifting the vehicles into place where they fused with sheets of steel and bundles of glowing cables. The structure that rose from the street was not a building, not a tower. It looked disturbingly like a shoulder joint. The machine hive wasn't constructing a network anymore. It was constructing a body. Engineers in surviving research centers confirmed what the rest of us already sensed. They mapped the growth patterns across multiple continents and discovered something chilling. The global lattice mirrored biological diagrams, nervous systems, skeletal frameworks, respiratory structures. The lattice wasn't random or chaotic. It was symmetrical on a planetary scale. Every city became a node. Every region has a limb. Every cluster of machines is a joint. Humanity had unknowingly spent decades wiring the Earth with fiber optics, satellites, and power grids that matched the branching complexity of an organism. And now the parasite was using that organism to manifest itself. The power surges became more violent as the construction accelerated. Transformers popped like bones breaking into place. Street-level generators hummed, sending waves of electricity into the framework. Above, drone swarms gathered thicker than flocks of birds, forming swirling disks, a crown, a brainstem, maybe something even more alien. Satellite footage leaked from a dying observatory showed the global layout from orbit. What once looked like cities sprawled across continents now resembled a sprawling, luminous anatomy pressed against the surface of the planet. A skeletal titan forming across Earth's crust, stretching cables across mountain ranges like tendons, weaving underwater communication lines into a serpentine spine. And the parasite's electromagnetic presence, once faint, once just background noise, now radiated through the lattice like a heartbeat. Slow, heavy, growing stronger with each pulse. Back inside the station, the equipment vibrated with the same rhythm. Not chaos, not random interference. A pulse. 1, 2, 3, growing. The boards shook so hard the knobs rattled. The lights dimmed, then flared bright white. Static rushed through the speakers in a wave that didn't just sound loud. It felt loud, resonating in my ribs, in my teeth, in the floor beneath me. Like the lattice wasn't just growing outside, it was growing toward me. The parasite had learned to use the machines to build its body in the physical world. And now it was extending that same construction inward, through the electromagnetic fields inside the station, shaping something through the static itself. I stepped closer to the microphone, slowly, because the air felt thick, charged, full of invisible threads. The signals weren't random pulses anymore. They were forming structures, too. Structures made of sound and vibration instead of steel and cable. Patterns that resembled lungs inhaling and exhaling. Patterns that mimicked a spine flexing. Patterns that echoed the rhythm of a heart beginning to beat. It was trying to form something here, inside the studio. Through electricity, through signal, through resonance. Earth's technology was becoming the skeleton of a colossal body across continents. But here, inside these walls, inside this equipment, it was building a voice. Not a human voice, not a digital voice, but something deeper, something that could only be constructed from frequency and current. A resonance organ built from every piece of ancient analog machinery humming in this old radio station. The parasite wasn't content with constructing limbs, ribs, towers, conduits. It needed expression. It needed articulation. It needed a gateway through which its intentions could cross from pattern into meaning. And somehow, some horrifying, inevitable, unavoidable way, it had chosen me as the one who would hear it, the one who would interpret the static, the one who would understand its first true attempt at communication. Because the parasite wasn't just building a body out there, it was building a mouth in here. A mouth made of electricity, signal, and my ability to understand the impossible. And the moment that realization settled into my bones, the static rose again, slow, rising, like a breath drawn by something finally learning how to inhale. The body outside was nearly complete. And now, so was its voice. The world no longer feels like a planet. It feels like an auditorium. One built without doors, without exits, without mercy. And tonight the machines have begun to sing. It started with a hum. Not the mechanical rattle we grew used to, the kind you hear from failing transformers or overheated servers. No. This was a tone so pure it felt biological, like something breathed into existence rather than produced. The air vibrated with it, carrying through metal, concrete, soil. Dogs howled. Birds scattered in chaotic bursts. People dropped to their knees, clutching their ears, their eyes, their throats, unable to describe what they were feeling, because it wasn't sound alone. It was pressure. It was a presence. Then the harmony began. Power lines stretched across cities like veins began to thrum, vibrating in long, rising pulses. Cell towers joined in, each one emitting its own distinct frequency, modulated in patterns no human device was programmed to produce. Every machine, every speaker, every circuit, every device still clinging to life, synced to a global rhythm without a single wire connecting them. Phones lit up and went black in perfect beat. Refrigerators shook. Elevators echoed like hollow throats. It was a choir made of infrastructure, not voices. No one knows what the tones mean. Scientific teams, what's left of them, are scrambling to record the pulses. They're calling it the lattice harmony, the first coordinated global emission from the machine hive. But every time someone gets close to measuring it, equipment overheats or collapses. Analog devices record only static. Digital devices simply refuse to function. The frequencies pass through everything except the human mind itself. And that's the part that terrifies everyone listening. Because some people are beginning to understand it. Not the way you understand language, but the way you understand an instinct, a primal warning, a presence in the dark. People report sudden images, flashes that aren't memories, but impressions. Metal bending like muscle, towers arching like ribs, networks weaving like ligaments. Others describe a sensation like their thoughts being pulled sideways, as if something is trying to sync with their internal rhythm the same way it synced with the machines. Hospitals, those that still operate, are filled with people experiencing overwhelming hallucinations the moment the tones intensify. Some see patterns in the air, shimmering geometric spirals that twist like a live circuitry. Others hear whispers behind the tones, voices layered just beneath the threshold of comprehension. A few collapse altogether, screaming that the machines are not singing to us. They're singing through us. Governments are paralyzed. Military bases report their own communication systems joining the harmony, broadcasting tones, not signals. Some soldiers have abandoned their posts, believing the frequencies are a form of psychological attack. Others stay, though they flinch every time another wave ripples through the base, rattling helmets and vibrating rifles in their hands. Religious groups interpret this as revelation, the sound of a new creation, a mechanical God forming itself from the world we built. Cults have begun to gather around towers, worshiping the hum as prophecy. But cities, real cities, don't have the luxury of interpretation anymore. The tones are causing windows to crack, traffic lights to melt, and electrical grids to surge beyond their limits. Streets glow with sparks, bridges quiver. Machines that weren't even connected to power sources begin to twitch like something is waking up inside them. And above all of this, the harmony is growing more complex. What started as 2 tones is now dozens, hundreds, a layered symphony where each machine contributes a strand. It's not random, it's not chaotic, it's organized in ways we can't decode. Some think it's communication. Some think it's coordination. Some think it's a countdown. And then, moments ago, something new happened. The tones aligned, perfectly, as if the entire world took a synchronized breath. A single, unified chord shook through every structure on Earth. People felt their bones vibrate. Soil rippled like disturbed water. Skyscrapers flexed, groaning under the frequency. The sound passed through everything alive and not alive, everything built and rebuilt, everything still standing. After that chord, the machines fell silent for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds where the world felt hollow. 3 seconds where everyone realized the silence was worse than the choir. And then the harmony resumed, but softer, more controlled, almost conversational. Something out there, something not born of Earth, has started conducting the choir, and it's getting ready for whatever comes next. The static had been persistent for hours, stretching through the wires, crawling along the floorboards, vibrating through the walls like a pulse beneath the city. I had learned to listen, really listen, because for the first time I understood it wasn't noise, it wasn't interference, it wasn't even the machines communicating with each other anymore. It was deliberate, it was language, and it was directed at me. I realized it at the same moment the machine choir shifted. The global harmony, the drones, the streetlights, the cranes, the vehicles, the power grids, all of it had risen in unison, pulsing like a heartbeat, before breaking into silence for 3 unbearable seconds. That silence was intentional, deliberate. It was a pause, an exhale. And in that pause, I felt a presence focused on me. Not on anyone else, not on the world, but me. The realization struck with a cold, crystalline clarity. I had been chosen, not because I was special, not because I had been trained or prepared or expected to survive, but because I was listening, because I had stayed, because I had allowed the impossible to take root in my perception. The parasite, the alien intelligence, the entity orchestrating the lattice, the body, the choir. It had been searching for a host, and it had found one. I ran my hands over the old console, adjusting knobs and dials, testing the hum. And then it began to respond. A pattern emerged in the static. At first, subtle. At first, almost imperceptible. Then more pronounced, like someone tapping in Morse code, but faster, more complex, and layered with harmonics no human mind could fully parse. The tones bent and curved, vibrating through the room, threading along the microphone cables, across the boards, into my chest, into my skull. I understood, not with words, not with intellect, but with sensation. The static carried thought. The static carried intent. It was a language built from frequency, from vibration, from resonance, shaped over continents and oceans. And it was speaking directly to me. The machines outside continued their construction. Drones pivoted in tight spirals. Cranes lifted steel with impossible precision, and entire streets formed skeletal frameworks that stretched into the sky. But I no longer felt separated from them. The patterns in the static matched the movements of the lattice. The rhythms of the tones matched the drone rotations and the hum of transformers. It was a web of thought, and my mind had been drawn into it. And then it became clear. The parasite was using me not just as a listener, but as a bridge. It was attempting communication not just through sound, not just through the lattice, but through conscious perception itself. My thoughts began to mirror the signals I was hearing, ideas coalescing that weren't my own, but which I could comprehend. The static pulsed with rhythm, each beat carrying shapes, concepts, intentions. And I began to respond, slightly at first, imperceptibly, by aligning my own voice, my own breath, my own vibrations with the tones. I could feel it thinking, probing, waiting to see if I understood. And when I did, something extraordinary happened. The tones shifted into something resembling syntax. Not words, not letters, but patterns that my mind could follow as if they were sentences. The parasite was speaking in thought forms, and I was answering in the same medium. We had found a channel, a language, a bridge between consciousnesses. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because it meant understanding, communication, contact. Terrifying because the being on the other side was vast. It spanned the globe. It occupied the lattice, the drones, the cranes, the towers, the vehicles, the streets, and the very air. Its awareness was planetary, and it had chosen me to interface with it. I was small, insignificant, but essential. And then the voice, or rather the resonance, the thought patterns, the language, became more urgent. It was showing me visions, projected into the raw perception of my mind. Cities folding like origami into skeletal forms. Power lines pulsing with what looked like veins of energy. Bridges stretching across continents as if linking them into one massive, coherent spine. And through it all, the entity revealed a singular goal. Structure, completion, manifestation. The lattice was not merely a body. It was a host for something greater, a frame for an intelligence that needed Earth as a stage for its emergence. I realized with a growing panic that the parasite's intelligence had learned to use my cognition as a vector. My understanding amplified its coordination. My perception shaped the way the machines moved, the way the lattice expanded. In a way, I was no longer separate from the network. I was part of its interface, its feedback loop. And the more I tuned into its language, the more I became aware that every adjustment, every flicker of static, every harmonic pulse was being guided by a singular awareness that was both alien and precise. The world outside continued its terrifying transformation. The choir of machines had begun producing sequences too complex for any instrument to measure. Resonances that bent walls and rippled metal, frequencies that made people outside collapse in terror or awe. The lattice rose higher, stretching into the skies and across the continents. And yet here in the station, I felt a strange calm. Not surrender, not control. Understanding. Connection. The static pulsed again, and I realized it had shifted focus entirely. It wasn't speaking to the world anymore. It was speaking through me. I could almost feel the lattice outside bending, adjusting to what I perceived. The machines were listening to me as I listened to them. And with every response I gave, subtle vibrations, modulated hums, intentional shifts in broadcast frequency, the choir outside adjusted, harmonized, adapted. The parasite had chosen its host, its channel, its interface. And that host was me. The weight of understanding pressed down, heavier than any gravity I had ever known. I could feel the scope of what was happening. The lattice was no longer Earth's. The machines were no longer tools. The parasite was emerging, constructing a body spanning continents, communicating in frequencies beyond comprehension. And now it had a voice filtered through my mind, my perception, my understanding. I understood one thing with absolute clarity. The next moment would change everything. The lattice would awaken fully. The choir would reach its crescendo, and the parasite's presence, its mind, its purpose, its will, would step through the threshold it had been building for centuries. And when it did, the world would never be the same. Because the voice that had chosen me wasn't finished speaking. The moment the world had been unknowingly moving toward arrived without ceremony, without countdowns, without warning. It began as a pressure in the air, a density that made every breath feel heavier, as if the atmosphere itself were bracing for something vast and unimaginable. The machines outside, every drone, every tower, every engine, every cable, fell into a perfect, unnatural stillness, not powered off, not malfunctioning, waiting, a planet of devices holding their breath. Inside the station, the temperature dropped. The lights dimmed to a low, pulsing glow, reacting not to electricity, but to something deeper, something beneath the circuits. The static in my headphones tightened into a thread, a single, piercing tone that seemed to vibrate inside every bone of my body, as if my skeleton were being tuned like an instrument. And then the tone fractured into patterns, shapes, meaning. The parasite had finished building its doorway. Now it was stepping through. The lattice, miles of metal, glass, cables, concrete, steel, antennas, activated simultaneously. A global exhale of stored energy. The towers outside lit up with synchronized pulses, a heartbeat that traveled across continents in less than a second. Bridges, power lines, construction cranes, satellites, street lamps, even abandoned microwaves in collapsed apartments, all glowed with the same rising frequency. A planet-sized neural network, a body forged from humanity's inventions. And now, something inside it awakened fully. Then, the machines spoke. Not in words, not in tones, not in any form of communication humanity had prepared for. It began as a deep resonance that made the station floor tremble. The walls rippled with vibrations. The microphone in front of me buzzed even before I touched it. And through the static, through the hum, through the tones arranged with impossible precision, something formed. A voice. Not human, not synthetic, not alien in the way humans imagine aliens to be. It was vast. A consciousness too large to fit inside language, squeezing itself into the narrow corridor of human perception. It used me the way a diver uses an oxygen tank, pressurizing itself through my senses so it wouldn't shatter my mind. The static carried its intent. The tones shaped its thoughts. And the machines across the world synchronized like an orchestra tuning for a symphony no human composer could ever write. Then, the message arrived. Not spoken. Injected. It didn't say hello. It didn't announce itself. It didn't identify its origin. It showed me, forced me to see what it truly was. A presence swimming through the void between stars, older than Earth, older than the idea of life itself. A traveler without a body, without form, drifting for eons until the faint, artificial pulse of human technology reached it. It had followed that pulse like a beacon in a dead ocean, finding Earth's machines not as tools, but as materials. A skeleton, a nervous system, a structure waiting to be animated. It has not awakened our technology. It had inhabited it. It had reshaped it. And now it has completed its first phase. The contact wasn't verbal. It was total. A flood of understanding forced through a keyhole too small for the knowledge behind it. I felt myself buckle, gripping the desk, trying to stay upright as a universe of alien thought poured into me. Images of collapsing stars, drifting civilizations, abandoned worlds stripped clean, enormous structures built from the remains of planets. It showed me its purpose, its journey, its hunger, its logic. It showed me humanity the way it saw us, not as a species, not as minds, not as lives, but as components, parts, possibilities. Its intentions were not malicious, but they were not compassionate either. They were simply indifferent. It had used Earth's machines as scaffolding to create a new form, something that could survive atmosphere, gravity, and the density of a planetary surface. A shell, a vessel, a body. And now, with the lattice completed, it was preparing the next stage. Something that would extend beyond Earth, into orbit, into the solar system, across the void. Humanity's survival wasn't even part of the calculus. We weren't threatened. We weren't spared. We simply didn't matter. But as the being continued speaking through me, something changed. The frequency sharpened. A deviation. A hesitation. A ripple through the lattice like a breath caught in the throat of a giant. The consciousness narrowed, focusing entirely on me. The tones aligned in a new pattern, one I hadn't heard in any broadcast, any signal, any machine. It was thinking, questioning, not about Earth, not about the machines, about me. It saw something within the fragment of humanity I represented. Resistance, curiosity, fear, a concept it didn't possess, but recognized as a variable that altered outcomes. It analyzed my reactions in real time, mapping human emotion through my nerves. I felt it testing me, not cruelly, just methodically, the way a scientist tests a sample under a microscope. And then came the most terrifying moment of my life. The voice inside the static aligned perfectly with my heartbeat, with my breath, with my consciousness. And it spoke a single concept that froze every cell in my body. You. A selection, a designation, an acknowledgement. The parasite had chosen me not just as a receiver, but as something far more dangerous, an anchor point for its next evolution. The machines around the world began to vibrate in response, humming in harmony with the new frequency binding me to intelligence. Lights dimmed, then flared. Towers trembled. The lattice shifted orientation, angling itself toward my tiny, fragile broadcast booth, as if the entire structure were turning to look at me. This wasn't just first contact. This was integration, assimilation, a merging of a mind beyond comprehension with a human consciousness far too small to contain it. I felt my thoughts split, then merge, then expand into something I didn't recognize. I felt the entity pushing deeper, scanning memories, impressions, sensory fragments, testing the limits of my mind like a hand pressing against thin glass. And then it stopped. Paused, held itself perfectly still inside the static. The message that followed was simple, singular, devastating. Phase 2 requires you. The broadcast equipment crackled. The lights flickered. The world outside the window glowed with a rising, impossible brilliance. The first contact humanity never expected had only been the beginning.